Bonjour tout le monde. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Louis Gosselin, doctoral candidate at the Université du Québec à Montréal in sociology. My paper is entitled Between God, Sankara, and Good Governance, Meanings of Moralization Among Religious Youth in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. On December 11, 2010, Burkina Faso celebrated the 50th anniversary of its independence. While the President Blaise Compaoré used the Jubilee as a platform for celebrating his own actions regarding economic development and democratization, most of the popular reaction pointed to the economic stagnation, enduring corruption, and persisting dependence that characterized most of the post-1960 history of the country. This negative perception was in particular witnessed among members of Catholic, Islamic, and Pentecostal youth associations in the capital city of Ouagadougou during field work I conducted in 2010 and 2011. Most of these youth mentioned corruption as the main problem faced by the country and called for a general redressing of the morals. However, this rather consensual call for moralization hides contradictory visions about which values should drive it. Moralization is a rather vague term. However, it is frequently encountered in African public discourse, especially in Francophone Africa. It points to a general will to promote a stricter moral behavior, but in the context of the reactions to the 50th anniversary of independence, it also opened into debates on economic morality and attitudes toward wealth accumulation in the perspective of economic development. These debates were framed in a double opposition. Today's Burkinabe youth can reflect on two moralizing historical moments, which are both characterized by the promotion of a good behavior, while differing greatly in the economic morality that they advocated. First is the socialist revolution of Thomas Sankara, which took place from 1983 to 1987, and the second is early 21st century good governance policies advocated by the international institution and adopted by the government of Burkina Faso in the recent years. Sankarist and good governance morality share complementary aspects, such as the will to impose a strict virtuous behavior on citizens, and in particular on civil servants. However, they differ greatly on their respective moral readings of economics. The socialist morality stressed by Sankara claimed to be rooted in the historical endogenous notion of solidarity and common good, and was thus voiced as a remoralization project based on an idealized vision of a pre-colonial moral economy as it was defined by E.P. Thompson. On the other hand, good governance is grounded in neoliberal economics and promotes the need for African societies to adopt a new and more rational policies in order to make way for private wealth accumulation and economic development. These contradictory historical influences are doubled with a similar theological opposition regarding moral attitude towards the economy. This refers to Max Weber's classical distinction between Catholic and Protestant influences on economic ethics, the Catholics being mostly defiant of individualistic wealth accumulation and of an economic system which values wealth creation as an end, while the ethos of radical reformed churches possess quote-unquote elective affinities with capitalism, according to Weber. The rise of Pentecostal Christianity at the end of the 20th century reactivated this analysis, which seems to fit perfectly with the spectacular embracing of neoliberalism by these churches, especially those that profess the so-called prosperity gospel, according to which one's rebirth in Christ is to be rewarded by material wealth. Recent literature on Islam have pointed to similar cleavage between interpretations that promote a moral economy based on the redistributive content of the Quran and the Sunnah on the one hand, and on the other hand, other tendencies mainly linked to the broad Salafi movement that promote an ethic of accumulation and individualism that closer to the imperatives of neoliberal capitalism. These varying attitudes towards economic policies are appropriated, and moralities are appropriated in various ways by young religious militants. 23 years after the assassination of Thomas Sankara, his memory was well alive among young religious militants. For many of them, Sankara is the perfect example of an upright leader who worked for his country's best interest, in contrast with current President Blaise Compaoré and his political order, which are widely described as corrupt and integrated into the new colonial order. This vision is widespread among Burkinabe youth, religious or not, but it is reinforced by the important presence in religious associations of the former pioneers of the revolution, now aged in their mid-30s. These were school children during the revolution who were taught revolutionary principles, slogans, and values. This very specific generation generally retains a strong nostalgia for the revolution and tends to read contemporary political issues in the light of their revolutionary education. Many of these former pioneers are in leading positions within religious associations, and we can notice a transfer of energies from early revolutionary education to religious militancy immediately or a few years after Sankara's death. So, let's make the hypothesis that, considering the closure of the political space with the Compaoré regime, the religious sphere might have been considered as a relatively free space where to work for the transformation of society from below, in conformity with revolutionary values and morality. Several life history narratives I've collected point to this transfer of militancy from revolutionary. I don't have time to go into the details, but that revolutionary language and values have been carried over to the religious field, especially expressed in terms of moralization. However, while the link between the proper individual good behavior commanded both by revolutionary ideals and by religious morality is evident among former pioneers of the revolution, the Sankarist moral economy is not so much claimed. On the contrary, early 21st century economic morality seems to be all about the hegemonic neoliberal ethics, which seem rather consensual among religious youth associations, leading to some creative reinterpretation of the Sankarist economic project. Among Pentecostal youth, discussion about moralization inevitably led to calls for a global change of mentality from a so-called traditional culture that supposedly impedes the possibilities of economic progress by its insistence on family solidarity and redistribution, to an enthusiastic embracing of capitalist accumulation. In an interview, almost all Pentecostal youth adopted a discourse that valued individual entrepreneurship as the most morally acceptable attitude. And these youth were subjected to constant preaching in this direction from the main Pentecostal preachers in the city. Why this kind of discourse is kind of expected from Pentecostal Christians, it was also widespread in other communities as well, with some nuances that I don't have time to express. And that despite of the apparent rooting of Catholic and Islamic morality in moral economies. For the younger militants of all confessions who have only lived under the Compaoré regime, the entrepreneurial ethics seem the only way forward. In their view, moralization is mostly equated first with the strict observance of religious obligations, and second, with a work ethic which encourages individual wealth accumulation. The state is viewed as an intrinsically corrupt bureaucracy that is impenetrable without either the support of a high profile official or the use of bribery. On the opposite, the ambient discourse on the virtues of private enterprise leads many to dream of a potential space where prosperity and honest work is possible. Imran, a young Salafi militant, summarizes this view. Quote, "From top to the bottom, they're all corrupt. Ministers, deputies, civil servants, the cops. I won't pass an examination. I want to live for my project. Start a small business on my own." Unquote. So, As I've mentioned before, the former pioneers of the revolution thank you, read contemporary politics through the lens of an idealized revolutionary morality. However, while they strongly disapprove of the general state of corruption that characterizes contemporary Burkinabe society, they do not, as a rule, hail revolutionary moral economy as much as they see Sankara as a former example of good governance. So many former pioneers read the ethical, economic significance of the revolution through the lens of contemporary neoliberal policies and ethics. A good example is that of Bouba, a long-time militant of the Association des Jeunes Musulmans at Ouidi, Youth Muslim Association, neighborhood association, and a former pioneer as well. While he was trained as a topographer at the university, he's mainly a salesman for a cosmetic company that is structured along the so-called multi-level marketing model, meaning he does not only earn money from his own sales, but also, and perhaps more so, from recruiting the new salesperson and earning a percentage on his recruit sale. This model has been described as very popular in Southern countries, so that it permits, it's a space where people can dream of benefiting from the possibilities of the neoliberal economic order. So, in conclusion, this research shows that while moralization can cluster oppositional forces against a corrupt regime, it can also paradoxically be co-opted by the hegemonic economic ideology that sustains the very same regime.
Please, I will encourage us to note our points and questions and maybe reactions to the presentation. We want to take all the papers, then we will allocate time for questioning and response. So we'll move to the next paper. When it is 2 minutes more, then we will begin the class.
Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Kamogelo Motshidi, and this afternoon I'll be taking you through my paper, which was titled Faith with a Fighting Chance: The Role of Religion in Shaping South Africa's Social Movements. So the outline is broken down as such. I'll look at South Africa's liberation movement, which is the African National Congress, or the ANC. We'll look at the founding fathers and the founding principles of the ANC. This is important to note because later on in the paper, we'll do an analysis of whether or not present-day ANC is adhering to the principles of the founding principles. And then the paper progresses to look at the role of faith and religion during apartheid. And then further on, we look at the role of faith and religion during South Africa's transition from apartheid to a democratic South Africa. And then, as I've just mentioned, we'll look at the role of faith and religion in present-day South Africa, and then we'll conclude. Now, it's important to understand the cornerstone segregation laws in South Africa. In 1909, the paper is a historic overview. So in 1909, South Africa was under British rule. And as such, the Union of South Africa Act was implemented. Now, this law denounced the rights of any persons not of European descent, and they were therefore treated as third-class citizens. And then fast forward to 1913, the implementation of the Native Land Act came into play. And this act reallocated land. In essence, 97% of the land in South Africa was given to the white majority, whereas only 3% of land was given to the mainly African minority. And this is important to note as we proceed. In order to react to the laws, in 1912, what was regarded as the South African Native National Congress, or what we now know as the ANC, was founded. And its founding fathers, one of which, the first president being Dr. John Langalibalele Dube, he was the first president of the ANC. And his intention was to empower Africans to become economically, socially, and politically free. Because he was a clergyman, he sought to bring synergy between religion and politics in daily life for the masses. The first Secretary General was Saul Blackie, and the man whom the ANC is attributed as his brainchild is Pixlika Isaac Aseme. Now he is the one who is regarded as the one who most clearly saw the need for African unity, considering the exclusion that Africans were experiencing at the time. So at its inception, the ANC's founding fathers foresaw the ANC as a vehicle that would work towards uniting different members of society. And in such, the aim was to secure the liberties and the rights of freedoms of Africans who were subject to the injustices of the aforementioned laws. Now, we'll look at the role of faith and religion during apartheid. So in 1948, apartheid came to be what we now know it as, and it was instituted by the National Party. Now, interesting to note that it was supported by the NG Kerk, which is known as the Dutch Reformed Church. They supported apartheid. And naturally, this led to opposition from other sects of Christianity who stood against apartheid. And as such, an important example to note is Dr. Beyers Naudé. He was actually a minister in the NG Kerk, and he risked his own life by leaving his predominantly white parish in order to pastor an African parish. Now, this also just shows how religion and the role of faith played in addressing apartheid when it was at its peak. So to further highlight this, it shows that more individuals and more denominations were seeking to break down the racial barriers that were existing. And this led to the formation of organizations like the Christian Institute, like the South African Council of Churches, and the Institute of Contextual Theology. These organizations associated themselves with the liberation movement, and they were in solidarity with the liberation movement. And at the time when South Africa was at the peak of the state of emergency, an important document was introduced. This document became known as the Kairos document. And the Kairos document called for a prophetic theology that would articulate an unambiguous response to apartheid. And when we look at the role of religion and faith in South Africa's transition from apartheid to a democracy, I'll just give you a quote from former President Thabo Mbeki. He had this to say. He said, "The new South Africa is born out of a broken and battered society. It is disfigured by the evil and corrupt apartheid system. It cries out for hard political and socio-economic transformation, which must be achieved if our country is to save itself from destruction. But it cries out also for spiritual power and resources to heal, to reconcile, to rebuild, and to restore South Africa's humanity. South Africa is crying out for its soul." And a quote like this just highlights the importance that faith was attributed to in addressing apartheid and the transition. So in 1989, the Organization of African Unity, which is now known as the AU, the ANC, apartheid representatives, as well as religious leaders, they met in Harare, Zimbabwe. And at this summit, what was born out of the summit was what became known as the Harare Declaration. Now, the Harare Declaration actually laid the foundation for the negotiations that led to the abolition of apartheid. And so, in 1991, South Africa was at the brink of a racially fueled civil war. And this was evident in that there was so much unrest on the ground that there was actually massacres happening in the country, particularly in in peripheral townships, namely Bibatong and in Bisho. And as such, this is what led to the Codesa. The Codesa is just the general term for the negotiations that led to the ending of apartheid. And so as such, at the occurrence of the massacres, the ANC, as well as the National Party leaders, they called for a faith-based intervention. In other words, they called for faith-based organizations to engage with the people on the ground on a more micro level. And this is being regarded, South Africa was actually regarded as the first country in the world whereby religious and political leaders came together in order to seek a way to chart for transformation. And as such, post-1994, in 1995, when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was instituted, which was chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, this, with the help of organizations like the National Religious Leaders Forum, what the government was doing at the time was gaining theological insight to political issues. And this further just highlights the role and the emphasis that was placed on the importance of faith-based organizations in moving South Africa forward. And right, but now fast track, and here we are today. Where exactly what role is faith playing in present day South Africa? Currently, the struggle is no longer a political struggle. It has become more of an economic freedom struggle, considering the fact that there's so much inequality and so many differences within society. And this may lead one to ask the question, is the present ANC adhering to the principles of the founding members? Is it adhering to its core foundations? And if not, where did they miss the mark? Because the corruption and all these incidences that lead one to ask this pertinent question. I'll just raise an example. More recently in South Africa's history, there was a labor dispute. And this labor dispute actually ended in a bloodbath, which became known as the Marikana Massacre. Now, the laborers who were in contention with their employers had actually lost trust in their trade union representatives. And post the unfortunate incident where lives were lost, the South African Council of Churches and the Congress of Traditional Leaders were actually called upon to intervene. And this was a first, whereby faith-based organizations were requested to intervene in a standard labor issue. So it just proves to show yet again that faith-based organizations and religion does play an important role. So to conclude, the paper concluded that social and economic history shows that religion and faith-based initiatives have played a central role in shaping the liberation movement as we know it and redefined the course of South Africa's history. The liberation movement could not have occurred independently of other structures, both internally and internationally. Furthermore, the way in which people act within a movement is influenced by the role of the beliefs they hold. And it also shows that there is a fundamental role that faith-based organizations play in social reform and transformation. And also, the paper also concludes that it is important to gauge the relationship between all sectors of society, including the relationship between state.
I do hope we are noting our questions for the panelists. So we move to the third panelist, and that's Ben Weiss.
My paper is on Christianity in German Southwest Africa, a medium for the synthesis of Herero identity. And before I get into it, I'm just going to offer a brief roadmap so you know where the argument is going. I'll introduce the topic as well as my argument. I will move on to a contextualization of the 1904 rebellion, war, and genocide. And then I will move on to a contextualization of what post-genocide reality was for the Herero people. And that's where I get into a discussion of the current historiography, which I contest in some of its nuances. And from that point, I will use some specific examples to make my case for contesting that historiography, and then I will offer some concluding remarks. So what this paper is about is exploring the Herero rebellion and genocide and the integration of remaining Herero into a post-genocide existence, and ultimately the reemergence of Herero culture and identity. My argument is that this piece is about how the results of individual and cultural dehumanization translated into Herero capacities for resilience and reconstruction. So I create a pretty stark dichotomy between the destruction that was visited upon the Herero people and the cultural resurgence that followed that. And I think that ultimately this is reflected in the title. I got to the end of writing this paper with the word survival instead of synthesis in the title, and this is not a narrative about survival, it's a narrative about empowerment. So for a little background context, the protectorate that is now Namibia as a German colony was purchased by a German entrepreneur in 1883, and eventually protection of trade routes brought German colonial jurisdiction to the territory. Obviously, as in many cases, this created a lot of tension with the indigenous populations, and that just continued to grow as German presence grew in the area. And eventually in 1904, that led to open rebellion and a war, and what preceded was effectively a genocide. This is evidenced by the German military leader who was put in charge there, General von Trotha, who had already gained a reputation for brutality in putting down the Boxer Rebellion and putting down some East African rebellions. And this was evidenced in communiques that he sent to the German government. For example, one read, "As I see it, the Herero nation must be destroyed as such. I ordered the warriors to be court-martialed and hanged, and all women and children who sought shelter here to be driven back into the Kalahari Desert. I deem it wiser for the entire nation to perish." And so what we see beyond the physical reality of Herero existence here is the utter destruction of their identity and culture, because clearly in these documents, any concept of humanity was disregarded. And by May 1906, as a result of labor camps and concentration camps, somewhere between 65,000 and 100,000 Herero had perished. A very small percentage of the population was left alive. So moving on to the post-genocide reality, there were a couple of different routes that the Herero take. Mine is specifically about those who stayed within German jurisdiction, but I do want to note that several populations left several groups left the country, and other groups took up nomadic lifestyles to become demographically invisible in the central areas of Namibia. But the most prominent foundation of post-genocide reality for the Herero was that religion was critical. In 1908, diamonds were discovered on the coast of Namibia, and that brought thousands and thousands of settlers, which also built up religious infrastructure. For example, one missionary church gained 6,000 new members in just 1 year. And that was the case across the board. A very prominent scholar on this topic, Janbar Giwald, argues that during the course of time it came to be the case that to be Herero it was necessary to be Christian because they were integrated and assimilated into that society, and other scholars talk about the concept that this reflected obedience and industriousness for the Herero that joined these missionary schools. And so that's the prominent historiography, that it was a necessary component of survival. And I'm going to use several specific examples to disagree with that and say that it was more than survival, it was about empowerment and resilience, and the Herero actually led lifestyles that were very much contested by the German authorities past that point. So the first point I want to make is about religious competition. The Roman Catholic Church and Lutheran missionaries were basically in competition to save souls among the Herero people, and the Herero knew this, and they basically played the two groups off of each other to offer a better church community environment for themselves, including education. The second point I want to make under that is that the Herero actually used their skills of learning just the literature behind the theology to actually justify some indigenous Herero practices such as polygamy. So they were actually arguing the religious texts with the people who brought the religion to them. Another point I want to make is about labor. So after the concentration camps and the labor camps were disbanded, there was a huge labor shortage for the white settlers, and the Herero actually played the settlers off of each other to gain better salaries for the work they were doing. As far as dress wear goes, they integrated very much so into a Victorian-era style of dress as a means to get better paying jobs and also authoritative positions within the governance of the colony. This is also reflected among military dress, where members of the Herero military, which ended up participating significantly in the nationalist movement SWAPO, actually used German military uniforms, and their ranking structure used pseudonyms of prominent German military leaders for their ranking systems. This was also reflected as well in mission school promoting a lot of entrepreneurs in the Herero culture, which actually ended up producing a lot of cultural centers where there were a lot of parties that celebrated indigenous practices. This was also reflected in funerals, where several funeral processions were held that were straight up forbidden by the colonial government, and they actually integrated German funeral proceedings such as school children holding pom-poms into these practices as kind of their way of saying, you can't stop us, we're going to celebrate our indigenous culture. In terms of the long-term context, this wasn't just a resilience under the German colonial authority. This also occurred once authority was transferred to South Africa. The most prominent example is under farming. So they returned to pastoral lifestyles and tried to reclaim their lands. There were a lot of what the government deemed as illegal squatters who actually used to own that land there. Furthermore, when the Union of South Africa tried to confine them to reserves, they actually lobbied with petitions and pursued in South African courts an expansion of those reserves so that they could usefully farm on it. So this extends throughout. And just to offer a couple of concluding points, I think that the starting point was Christianity, and the Herero realized that, and they utilized that to their advantage to express several unique features of rebuilding their identity. And contrary to the previous historiography, I would argue that the conformity and compliance under Christianity was all a facade that was used for empowerment. And finally, despite the horror that is the history of the Herero genocide and rebellion, the endeavor featured in my work is not a narrative of victimization, but instead one that speaks to the power of the Herero legacy.
Thank you, Weiss. So we move to Olivier Tchouaffe.
Yeah, you said that right the first time.
Oh,
Tchouaffe. Yeah, got it.
I'm getting old.
Yeah. So my paper is going to be thoughts on religious activism and democracy in Africa. Okay, for somebody like me who's I would say neo-Marxist or something. I was really surprised that there's been a shift in the last decade, right? This kind of religious conflict, the political conflict, right? But have this overt religious overtones, right? You can take Ivory Coast, Syria, Sudan, Mali, Libya, Palestine, Nigeria, you know, we have all these conflicts. And I was asking the question, how do you explain this kind of prominence of the religious discourse in politics, right? Because I'm still thinking about really, it's about material, it's about resources, not so much about religion, right? And then, first thing, I have to step back to understand these processes. And what I need to do first is to realize that these problems are not actually new, right? Because they've been framed in the media today as something new, where in fact, it's not, right? I'm from Cameroon, and we only got 2 presidents since the independence in 1960. So for the first time, from 1960 to 1982, we had a president who was from the north and happened to be a Muslim. And then from 92 to now, we have another president who from the south, who's a Catholic, right? And it was clear growing up that, when I was growing up in Cameroon, it was clear that the Muslim owned the country, right? All the big jobs and the president. So that was a big elephant in the room, right? And I also grew up next door to Nigeria, and we have a big Igbo population in Cameroon. And it was clear that the Igbo, there was a war in Nigeria too, the Biafra war. But if you even look at that, there were some religious overtones in there because the Igbo was mostly Christian. So, first of all, that's not new, right? And the second thing is that if it's not new, how do you understand the role of religion in politics? You know? Okay, there's a religious, it's there, right? There's a religious presence. Most people think that we live in a separation of church and state. In fact, we don't. Even now, what we say, right? Because you can take a religious point of view saying that for the religious point of view, most religion will tell you the earth, everything is earth is a creation of God. So we are God's children. And that's put into politics, because if we are, it's the idea that our source of ethics and morality comes from God. In that sense, we need political leaders who are morally upright, right? And most countries function like that. You need, I don't know any country who you don't want a religious leader who is not morally upright, right? So religious is there. So that kind of separation of church and state doesn't actually work in practice, no matter how you say it, right? I will take an example. In America, we have a separation of church and state, but I don't see how you're going to be president of the United States if you're not a Christian. I don't see that's going to happen, right? So it's there. Now, because it's there, then what are we going to do with it, right? It seems to me that we need some kind of pedagogy to talk about this kind of religious conflict, religious overtone. And there's certain things that we need to start to avoid. Last month in Cameroon, the Boko Haram, they went to the border to Cameroon and kidnapped a French family, right? There was a father and the wife and their friends and the 3 children, so they all kidnapped. And they came to Cameroon and took it, and then took it back into Nigeria, right? And it has created like a real frenzy now. Well, this Boko Haram, and I read even as yesterday, there was this professor who wrote a piece on Cameroon newspaper depicting the Boko Haram as some kind of cult, bloodthirsty, they like to kill people. And also you say it doesn't make a difference between moderate Islam and extremist Islam, because they all take the money from Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Iran to build mosque. And it was amazing that they had this kind of definition of the mosque as a terroristic occupation of spaces. So I think it's kind of getting out of control. Even on a global level, right? You remember that movie that came out called The Innocence of Muslim? It created a lot of problems, and the depiction of Prophet Muhammad. And I remember in the United Nations last year, right, President Obama said that at a time when anyone with a cell phone can spread offensive views around the world with a click of a button, the notion that we can control the flow of information is obsolete. The question then is how we respond. On this, we must agree there is no speech that justifies mindless violence. Okay, so that's Obama's perspective. But then the president of Egypt, right, at the same United Nations, Mohamed Morsi, said that the obscenities recently released are part of our organized campaign against Islamic entities is unacceptable and require a firm stand. We have a responsibility in this international gathering to study how we can protect the world from instability and hatred. So you see, on one side, you have a president who talks about freedom of speech, and on the other side, you have a president who talks about hatred. So there's a need for pedagogy here, and it's really important because of the book that I was reading from a French scholar called Antoine's Fair, for example. He noticed that most people don't know that actually in the Middle East, the biggest conflict in the Middle East is not Jews against Muslims. It's actually Muslim against Muslim, right? Especially the Shia and the Sunni. So there's this kind of a need for pedagogy, and then the question becomes, how are we going to teach religion, for example, in a classroom, right? And that's become an important question. So we can teach religion for a different kind of perspective, right? We can teach religion as a sociological construct, or in a historical construct, where that comes from. So there's a need here for a big pedagogy on issues of religion. And also another thing that I need to mention here is that it all happened in kind of a global context, and it's true that in African countries they're mostly corrupt. Cameroon is very corrupt, Niger is very corrupt, so you can see why religion becomes so important, because it becomes sometimes the only recourse for people to have some kind of a voice is to use a religion. But also talking about all those wars and everything, is this kind of the necessity for, because it's an international problem, to have an international judicial system, because some states are very weak and corrupt, that if you get if you wait for the state itself to judge its own people, that's not going to happen. That's kind of a dimension also need to be addressed. So my paper basically was on that, right? The need for a new pedagogy to understand the transformation of the political system in Africa. So I'm going to stop here.
Thank you very much. Well, the last panelist has come, and that's Dr. Olusola Akande from Obafemi University. So you're welcome.
Yes, sir.
And then you can go straight to your
Okay.
10 minutes.
Okay. I'm Dr. Tajudeen Adebisi Adewumi. I'm standing for Dr. Joshua Akande, who is unable to make it here. The title of the paper, I'll just read it, then after reading it, I take note of your comments and your questions. The title of the paper is War Against Ourselves, Ethno-Religious Conflicts in Nigeria, Implications for Promoting Community-Based Peace Education. He believes that ethno-religious contentions are the honest and deadliest problems confronting Nigeria today. And this has also been portrayed in most of the paper that have been presented in the course of this conference. He gives some illustrations. In 1980, we had Maitasene riots in Kano. We have ethno-religious crisis in Maiduguri in 1982, ethno-religious crisis in Kaduna in 1982, ethno-religious crisis in Yola, 1984, and of course in Gombe, 1985, we have another one. Also, he believes that ethno-religious conflicts always have serious consequences on the people, economy, and social infrastructures. I also believe that several attempts have been made at various times to tackle conflict through, number one, mediation or intervention. That is, after the conflict has occurred. And of course, dialogue is also another medium that have been explored. Number three, government inquiries. Number four, visits by government delegates to the troubled areas. Number five, relocation of local government councils and markets, because most of the time what brought about crisis may be because of citing the headquarters of the local government in a particular place. And of course, number six, provision of amenities and equitable development. And number seven, peace palace and reconciliation exercises. On building, still, that is introducing the study, the paper, building sustainable culture of peace. He believed that community-based bottom-up approach is inevitable. It's not the peace that will come from above, but will be built and generated from the community. Also, he says community-based peace education with participatory approach is required. Education is a very important tool for conflict prevention, according to him. He also believes that peace education is a panacea to incessant conflicts. Peace education helps people to understand the world in which they live and interdependence of individuals, groups, and nations. Now, the objective of his studies are, number one, to examine the concept of conflict with particular reference to ethno-religious conflicts in Nigeria. Number two, to ascertain the causes and consequences of ethno-religious conflicts in Nigeria. Number three, to accentuate the relevance and importance of community-based peace education as a panacea to ethno-religious conflicts in Nigeria. And of course, number four, to examine the adequacy or otherwise of some steps taken to resolve ethno-religious conflicts in Nigeria. Now, he progressed with a concept of conflict. According to him, he said conflict is endemic in poorer society. When you have multi-ethnics, multi-language in a particular society, conflict is bound to occur. Also say conflict is a continuous struggle or friction between different groups which arise in the process of interaction between individual and groups. Of course, he believes that it is the putative incompatibilities that precede a collision among people. It is a situation in which two or more motives are partially blocking each other or one another. Of course, according to him, conflict is a sharp disagreement or collision in objectives, interests, ideas, and the likes. Conflict is incompatibility between two opposing interests. And now he went on to discuss factors of conflict. He talked about conflict prevention. Prevention is better than cure, and either it goes. So it's always good to prevent conflict than settle conflict. Then he talked about conflict trigger. There are certain factors that bring about conflict in the community. And of course, conflict resistance. We don't want the conflict to happen. And of course, conflict explosion. When you have the trigger, you have a resistance, you don't want it to come up, and all of a sudden conflict can also explode when it goes beyond control. And of course, you have conflict dynamics. That is talking about dimensions of conflict. And of course, conflict resolution. Then he went on to discuss conflict management and conflict transformation. Now, causes of ethno-religious conflict in Nigeria are religious extremism, two, religious pluralism, secularism, intolerance, external factors, government, ambiguous exploitation, ignorance of faith and practice of other religions, discrepancies in religion itself, ecological factor, denial of social justice to masses. Now, on the concept of community-based peace education, he underlined 3 key word phrases there. Number 1 is the peace. 2, peace education, of course, community-based education. Concept of peace, he believed that a state of harmony, tranquility, concord and balance of equilibrium of power. A state of harmonious relationship, absence of violence, war, and freedom from disputes, mental stress or anxiety between individuals, groups, states, and nations. And of course, he said violence and war are opposites of peace. Concept of peace education is a non-violent learning process in life that also shapes human behavior towards cordiality in relation with other human beings. Of course, it is change of individual perception of others, in the hallmark, it says the hallmark of peace education, and of course the process of proactive enlightenment on the knowledge and skills of observing and responding to early warnings and indicators. Aims as objective for peace education is to develop people's awareness of the element that promote peaceful living and harmonious relation among families, friends, neighborhoods, and social groups and professional community, and also to raise awareness to foster peaceful coexistence among the people. Our concept of community-based peace education says in the process of social engineering whereby people, having become conscious of the problem of ethno-religious conflicts, organize themselves around the problem in order to foster the culture of peace. And of course, he concluded by saying that community participation in peace education is an essential variable to reduce ethno-religious conflicts and promote culture of peace in Nigeria. Another conclusion, he said, reducing incessant cases of ethno-religious conflict should not be seen as the sole responsibility of the government. And of course, community-based peace education should be promoted where the community members are incorporated into the culture of peace at the grassroots level. Lastly, he said religious pluralism and ethnic diversity should be utilized through community-based peace education to foster national unity geared towards sustainable. Thank you very much.
Well, we are still to time, and then I want to commend the efforts of all the panelists, particularly with regards to their very incisive presentation. So, the floor is open. Reaction, question. Let us make our questions or response or reactions very brief. Meanwhile, we will take the questions and then you just note these questions, and then when we have taken about 4 people, you respond, and then we go back to these. So, all right, 1, okay, 2, behind them, 3, all right. 4, 5. Okay, so we'll start with you.
Thank you, Chair. My question is to Ben, I think. I see you opted to use the nomenclature of German Western Africa as opposed to Namibia. Maybe you can enlighten us on why that choice. And then my other question goes to Kamogelo. I'm wondering whether it wouldn't be enlightening to reflect on the philosophical content at all those junctures, at all those points where the politicians or the come into contact with a religion. And I'm particularly aware that a lot of them at some crucial moments would go to ZCC gatherings. I'm not sure how to make of it. And then in the end, when South Africa has gone over the bridge, they opted for a secular state. I don't know how can you build that into your discussion so that it addresses those questions. Thank you.
So the next question. Okay, please.
Thank you, sir. My question goes to the second presenter, Kamogelo. I just want an understanding, because your paper talks about the role religion has played in shaping South Africa's social movements. Talking of religion, I want to know, were there no other religion in South Africa then, apart from Christianity? If there were, what were their roles and why didn't it reflect them? And presently now, we are still talking about how the Christian religious organizations, so to say, what you call faith-based organizations are actually Christian groups, are helping to move South Africa forward in mediation. Are there no other religions present in South Africa now? Are they not contributing anything to it?
Okay. Next.
For Ben Weiss, you kind of talk about the Hereros using Christianity. So I guess I was just curious, sometimes when we talk about these things, we can forget that people might actually be sincere in their religious beliefs. So do you think Hereros genuinely believed, or was it primarily kind of an instrumental thing?
The fourth person. Okay, yes.
Question for in regard to Sankara and Burkina Faso. My understanding is that after Sankara was overthrown and Blaise Compaoré came into office, I guess you could say, there was a structural adjustment program instituted, but there was really not the kind of unsustainable debt associated that is typically used to justify a structural adjustment program. And so I'm wondering how that might work into perhaps even especially the sort of the children of who were militants, the Sankara militants who have grown up, whether that has worked in at all with regard to the structural adjustment. And for Ben, just very briefly, in regard to the cultural preservation, is it how does that work into the ideas of is the Herero culture a stagnant thing, or was there more dynamism in terms of sort of a mutual change in the process of seeking power? If you could address that.
Okay, just the last person.
Thank you. I worked out an important question has been asked. Please pardon me.
Okay, okay.
Yeah. So,
that's all right.
The question I want to ask is related to the last paper, which is on peace education in Nigeria. Now, as a historian, I know that what he is saying is relevant, but there's also a historical angle to it. There are some people who, since colonialism, have rejected one type of education. That is Western education, so to say. When it came, they rejected it. The emirs accepted it, but the Talakawa was shut down. So we had Metasine. These are people who say, we want to overthrow the state, we don't want the kind of peace you offer. Today we have Boko Haram. They say this type of education that we're talking about, or perhaps part of it is bad. So in a situation where a group has a long history of rejecting this kind of education, how do you engage in dialogue to bring peace education in that community?
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe we can have you too.
Okay. It's a question to the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5
it's okay.
panelists. Just to know, in their conclusions, does religion still stand a chance of moving these countries you have all highlighted forward? Does it still have an impact in their development?
Okay. Okay. Sorry.
I've got a
Should I
question.
take all this together?
I've got a question for Kam.
Okay.
In South Africa, you find out that people express their concerns through violence, like you mentioned the Marikana massacre. So I wanted to know how religion, what religion can do to try and solve the culture of violence in South Africa.
Yeah, maybe while you ruminate on these questions, I just want to also add this to that. For Sankara and Kampore, I know that Thomas Sankara is a masses-driven kind of government that he brought, and people saw some kind of revolutionary acumen in him. But somehow, something very similar to what happened to what's the name in Congo, Patrice Lumumba. The external forces used, Kasavubu and Mobutu, to overthrow him. So I'm just wondering if we also have something similar, a situation where we have external forces that we can trace, the kind of government that we have now, because there's always this tendency of installing their stooge, in power, and therefore there will be no progress made. So I want the presenter to look at that, and to also look at the informing ideology that actually that each of these two leaders, what informed their kind of activities in governance. And then you talk of contradiction, of Christian, then this Pentecostal gospel of prosperity and all that, and how this had also contributed to the menace that we have in that place. I'm wondering if there were no other religions, even faith-based religions, that was sympathetic with even apartheid regime and could justify that even using the scripture. You see, we cannot just put that aside. You have to also recognize that. And maybe finally, under ethno-religious conflict, of what use will peace education for a system that produces a mass of unemployed, unskilled youth, and therefore ready-made, tools in the hands of some other manipulators? Of what use will peace education be in that kind of scenario? Well, these are part of the things we wanted to react to. Thank you. You may just look, identify one or two of the questions that you think will take care of all the others. So one by one, please. Thank you. 2 minutes, if possible.
I'll start first. So in response to the first question about the name, I am actually thankful that you brought that up, because that was adapted from a lot of the primary documents, which were German, that I was using, and I really didn't think that how I articulate, what we're calling the area is very much so a part of my concept of survival versus resilience and empowerment. So that's actually something I will consider, but that came from the primary source documents I was using. In terms of religious sincerity, I think that they're sincere in their pursuit of the religion itself, but not necessarily the German adaptations of that. If you recall, I mentioned how they actually argued the theological texts originally. And so I think the religion itself is sincere, but they integrated resistance into that. In terms of cultural preservation, I think very much so it was a dynamic approach, and I think that ultimately it featured a lot of syncretism in adapting what cultural aspects they could and integrating that into a new framework for viewing their culture. And in terms of the last question that was asked all four of us, this paper is primarily concentrated with basically a 15 to 20 year span at the beginning of the 20th century, and I just don't know enough about contemporary Namibia to really comment on that.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
Colleagues, firstly, thank you for your comments and your questions. I think I'll merge your two comments and questions in answering. You mentioned the question about the philosophical content and how Christianity is not the sole religion existent in South Africa. For I am aware of the fact that there have been other religions, and there still are. However, just for the purposes of the paper, the focus was predominantly on the role of Christianity. And with South Africa now being regarded as a secular state, in as much as that is so, emphasis is still continually placed on the fact that 79% of the population is Christian, and Christian with its different denominations. And in fact, in I don't want to say in recent history, but there's also been an increasing emphasis on the role of traditional or indigenous religions within South Africa. And I did mention, with regards to the way in which the government reacted to Marikana, it was not just the South African Council of Churches. However, the Congress of Traditional Leaders was also included in addressing the crisis. And to answer you, sir, with regards to some Christian propagators of apartheid,
yeah.
As I mentioned, the primary supporter of apartheid was the NG, which is commonly known as the Dutch Reformed Church. And in looking at the dynamics, it's important to understand the demographics thereof. Now, the Dutch Reformed Church, or the NG as it's known in Afrikaans, is rather still even a predominantly Afrikaner church. And as such, the National Party itself was predominantly Afrikaner. Now, it might lead one to ask the question, so how was it possible that such a minority was able to, because the Afrikaner population is actually smaller than the English population in South Africa. So it may lead one to answer, how was that even possible? And it became possible in the fact that they stuck together. When everything else was going in all sorts of directions, they stuck together, and that's how it was continued for such an extended period of time. And also just to go back to you, right now the ANC has also highlighted the importance of an interfaith emphasis. And for those who are not aware, when they start an ANC rally, they'll have a representative from each religion to open the session in prayer. And it's not just Christian based. So there has been an interfaith play. And it's also evident in what is being known as the Council of Religious Leaders, whereby it doesn't only just bring in Christian leaders, but it brings in leaders from all sorts, from all sectors. And the question about violence being used as a way to address issues in South Africa, I think that could primarily be attributed to the nature of South Africa's history. South Africa's history was a very violent one, and we must bear in mind that it was only 19 years ago when democracy came into play, and that's relatively young. And if we were to personify South Africa as a person, this would be South Africa's adolescent phase. And this is the phase of it finding itself. And we must bear in mind that the people living right now are those who were tortured by the apartheid government. The generation of 76 that was placed on electric chairs, they're the people who are currently unemployed, who did not get that chance to get them to further their education. And I suppose, not to make excuses, but if violence was all they knew, and whereby if you speak, you're not necessarily listened to, or when you try to speak during the times of apartheid, you weren't necessarily listened to. Human nature is to resort to what you know. And Steve Biko said this: the most powerful weapon of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And as a nation, South Africa's, our battle now is more of a psychological one. And that comes into play, and that takes generations to uproot. So I suppose that's where religion can come into play, because religious or faith-based organizations are at the grassroots, and they can reach people more at a micro level than government can. And in that regard, that I think religion can play a role in addressing the mindsets of people in order to shift gear, to become less violent, because violence is not always the answer. And yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Any more questions?
Maybe I can answer.
Okay, sorry, please go. Okay, sorry. Just before that, please, a special announcement. We are all being reminded to the reception tonight at 6:30 p.m. Holiday Inn, IH35 Riverside. So we are all invited for that dinner. So thank you very much for that. So please go ahead.
Yeah, for the first question about structural adjustment, you're right that very quickly after Sankara's assassination, Burkina Faso adopted a structural adjustment plan. I think it was 1989 or 1990. But the IMF recognized that outside of its realm, the Sankarist regime had managed some sort of self-adjustment, although too so socialist oriented in their view, but some kind of socialist austerity program, and the moral emphasis of Sankara, this whole political project, really served as a way to enforce this austerity. And that links to the last comment. Everything points to external forces as pushing this change, but we don't have definitive evidence of it, but it's most probable. But so there, I think today's youth can link good governance, the spirit of good governance, with Sankarists, or what they remind of, what they imagine of the Sankarist regime as some sort of continuum in this way. So that's why, and the government of Burkina Faso plays on this without explicitly referring to the Sankarist regime. They adopt austerity measures or moralization measures that cannot be understood as not being references to what Sankara did without mentioning it. So everybody plays on these moralization, austerity ideals And from the kind of religion move Burkina Faso forward, I think I will refrain from making broad statements about this, but what can I say is I'm pretty skeptical about the soul, the force, the moralization as a unique force of moving forward.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Yeah, we have taken note, written down the questions and the comments. But the education we are talking about here is not the education of A for apple or B for butter. It is not the education that, as we know it, is discussing the problem that really face the community. Somebody brainwashed them. It's a form of education. So they need to be brainwashed so that they can told the channel of peace. And of course, also the second comment about the employment is not the education that we really keep them busy doing something, is the peace education. If we go by the definition that is put here, that is, they have to come together, identify the problem, and find solution to the problem. But I will still give it to him. That is
Thank you. So, any other reaction?
You were asking the question about religion and development. And I think what we're talking about here, if you really see, the biggest problem is the capacity of the state to structure conflicts, and that's the crux of the argument. And in Cameroon, it's a very weird situation now because we have a president who's 80 years old, he's been in power for 25 years or something, and nobody knows what's going to happen when he dies, you know. So you just hope that we can start a conversation about institutions, right? So that's the point. Institutions and democracy, and that will give the state the power to manage conflicts. That's what you hope, at least that's going to get the ball moving. Because we know that if you look at those terrorist organizations like ACME in Mali or Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, those kind of operations tend to prosper when it's a vacuum of the state, right? So that's why basically in Mali they took over half of the country, you know, because there was no state in northern Mali. So that's the point. So what you need to do now is to engage people to start to reflect on the role of the state and the role of institutions.
Thank you very much. Do we have more questions? Because we can still afford to go one more round. Otherwise, then I think it's a job well done. We all deserve a round of applause.